Yeah, very good morning to you. It is Thursday, August 6, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and as always, we'll be rolling through five of the biggest stories in the world of sport right now. Absolute pleasure. Somebody I've been looking forward to welcoming to the show for a long time. Sydney Morning Herald reporter Tom Decent joins us from, I believe, Coogee, certainly the eastern suburbs in Sydney. How are you, Tommy?
Coogee Bureau is open for business. How are you, Pete?
Mate, I'm doing very well. Decent by name, very, very decent reporter by reputation. So we are going to fire straight into it and get some opinions and some analysis on some of these big stories. And we're going to start in the world of rugby union. And an article from Tim Horan in today's Courier Mail, of course, the Wallaby great, who writes that weekly opinion piece, looking at the clash between the New South Wales Waratahs and the Queensland Reds at the Sydney Cricket Ground on Saturday night. Horan saying it's time for the Waratahs to stand up and be counted if they want to play for Australia. Of course, winless so far in the Super Rugby AU competition, the New South Wales Waratahs. The Reds, on the flip side, have been very impressive. And if you were picking a form Wallabies squad tomorrow, you'd probably expect it to be fairly stacked with Queensland Reds and Brumbies players and maybe not that many New South Wales Waratahs players. Tommy, you're pretty close to the team and managed to spend some time there. I know you spoke with Jake Gordon at the Tars earlier this week about this big clash. Talk me through the vibe in their camp at the moment. And if you were picking a 30-man Wallabies squad tomorrow, which Waratahs would be in it?
Oh, look, I mean, yeah, Jake didn't sugarcoat, some comments earlier this week basically saying the relationship between New South Wales and Queensland isn't great. Now, I know that opening game of Super Rugby AU up there was pretty spicy, heated, a few scores to settle. So, the Waratahs are pretty wounded by that. The Reds had won 11 in a row. New South Wales had won 11 in a row and, had all the bragging rights. And then Queensland came back and won that game and absolutely loved it and gave it to them, privately. So you can understand why the Tars are fired up. And there's also a bit of pride on the line by way of Wallaby selections. Yeah, as you say, we're halfway through the season. There was only 3 players in that national interest squad that were picked earlier in the year. Michael Hooper, Jake Gordon, and Angus Bell, out of we don't know the exact numbers of that, but as you say, if you were to pick a Wallaby squad now, be it a 30, 31 man squad, I noticed Tim in that piece talks about there being 80% of, Reds players and Brumbies players within that. Now, the World Cup squad, I think, was only about 13 of the 31 were from those two clubs. So there's definitely less New South Wales stalwarts that will be there now. There's been some notable names leave that group, Foley, a whole number of, big stars. Look, I'd be inclined to say there's probably one definite, obviously Michael Hooper in that squad, which will definitely be there. And then there's probably 3 TBCs by way of Rob Simmons. Rob Simmons is obviously jetting off at the end of the year. Depends whether he's going to be wanted for test availability. The other one's young Will Harrison, the playmaker, whether they're going to pick him in there to try and blood him, by way of if Noel Alicia is not going to be there underneath, a guy like James O'Connor, Matt Tamua, sorry. And the other one is then obviously possibly Angus Bell, who could also get a run in there as well.
Yeah, I think in the case of Angus Bell, we haven't seen a young prop necessarily hit his straps in Super Rugby so quickly in quite some time. So I think a good shout there. He could be a bolter. I'm going to throw one more in the mix, Ned Hannigan. I think he's been pretty impressive since coming back from a long concussion layoff. Seems to have found his home in the second row, and with a dearth of Wallaby options at lock, I think he's somebody who could do a job for Dave Rennie. We move to our second story this morning, and by a mate of yours, Andrew Wu, in the Sydney Morning Herald, looking at the summer schedule chaos for Cricket Australia. Obviously, the Indian team coming out to tour. We've also got the Big Bash League and a one-off test against Afghanistan to fit in, all outside of the Indian Premier League and the quarantine requirements for any Australian players who go and play in that tournament in the UAE and then need to come home and isolate. Essentially, the crux of the article, looking at whether the Boxing Day test, so famously held in Melbourne for so long, should actually shift elsewhere if the MCG is unable to host a crowd. Adelaide's emerged as a potential host. We know they've got a fantastic facility there, the Adelaide Oval, that's been done up in recent years. Generally hosts a day-night test match. We also know they've got a hotel on site, which could really help from a quarantine perspective with both the Australian and the Indian teams. Now, Tommy, I'm going to preface this. I'm a Melbourne Cricket Club member, but is it time for the Boxing Day test in these current circumstances to move outside of Melbourne if they can't have a crowd?
Oh, for fair income and say I want to fill the coffers with some coin, I think we have to in these current situation. Yeah, I mean, Adelaide would be obviously an ideal place, as you say, good facilities, they can quarantine players there. Thornton, everything with our Melbourne friends. We don't know how long this is going to go to. It would be great if they could play some cricket there and there could be some, semblance of a crowd there that would, by way of actually something to look forward to for the people of Melbourne. But at this current stage, you can't envisage that's going to happen. I did laugh. I mean, obviously, if Adelaide do host it, Daniel Andrews' comment saying, "Why would you want to go to Adelaide?" Come back to bite him now, given that, possibly they could be pinching that Boxing Day test. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what CA think about it. But I think there would be nothing to say that Melbourne couldn't get another test in the years to come. So it's something they'd have to consider for sure.
Extenuating circumstances, very similar to the AFL Grand Final. And I think that the way the public have come around to the fact that if the AFL Grand Final can't be held with fans at the MCG, it should be held elsewhere so that fans can attend. I think a similar approach does need to be taken with the Boxing Day test. A little bit more time up our sleeves there with that one though yet. Our third story today comes from Peter Bedell in the Courier Mail. He's got a direct line to Wayne Bennett these days, and the South Sydney Rabbitohs coach has given some pretty spicy quotes, in the build-up to Friday night's Broncos South Sydney Rabbitohs grudge match. Of course, Bennett and Anthony Seibold swapping jobs there 18 months ago. A bit of a blindside on the way out from Seibold, suggesting that Bennett had been speaking to the players at the Rabbitohs before he officially joined them. Obviously, the Broncos, their worst ever season right now under Anthony Seibold, his job well and truly in the firing line. But some cracking quotes from Wayne Bennett and also from former South Sydney Director of Football, Shane Richardson. Essentially, Bennett rubbishing any suggestion that he'd been involved in anything happening behind the scenes at the Rabbitohs until he was sacked by the Broncos, that he didn't agitate to get out of the Broncos. He wanted to fulfill his contract there. And essentially putting the heat back on Seibold and saying it was Seibold who was the one who was agitating behind the scenes to swap teams a year early. I guess I want to speak more broadly, not to the specifics, Tom, of this article, but more to this rivalry that's developing between the Rabbitohs and the Broncos. It's getting spicier seemingly with every fixture. And if we go back to round 2 when they last met and the Broncos were victorious, they were on top of the table at the end of that match. The Broncos have got a fantastic record against the Rabbitohs. I think 23-9 overall head-to-head in the NRL era. Is this the spiciest rivalry in the NRL as things currently stand?
Oh, by far. I think it's fantastic. Well, it's amazing that each time these coaches come up against each other, it just gets trotted out again, and there's new quotes and great fodder and banter and slanging matches, and it does make for good reading and copy and interest by way of fans and us and everyone at home. But I mean, it does also, by the same token, act as a tool for coaches to divert attention, right? We've seen it with a number of coaches. Eddie Jones springs to mind. 2 minutes after kickoff, he's already floats out a quote, leading into a Wallabies week, him versus Checker. We've seen it multiple times. So it's clearly a diversion tactic of sorts, I think. Clearly, there's no love lost between those two, and that adds to the occasion as well. And that's what we want. We want also more than the storylines on the field. So, yeah, I mean, considering the situation that they're both in, Bennett going okay, Seibold right up against it. A couple of years left on that contract with an extension possibly for 2023 and not going very well. Fans, wanting his blood. It's probably not the greatest time for Anthony to engage in that stuff. He's probably better just focusing on his team. But it's good fodder. I love it. And I would imagine the general punter does too.
Yeah, you'd think the TV ratings would be pretty big for this one on Friday night, and it'll give a pretty fair illustration, I think, of whether that Broncos team are playing for Seibold, when you'll be able to directly compare their performance this coming week with that one back in round 2. Obviously, David Fifita back in the mix. We saw Darius Boyd shift to fullback last week and actually play a really good game there against the Sharks. So if the result is markedly different against the Rabbitohs team, who haven't really got any exponentially better or worse since that match, then it might be a pretty firm indicator that Seibold's lost that dressing room, perhaps. Our penultimate story today comes from Daniel Cherney in The Age, looking at the Collingwood Football Club. Nathan Buckley, the head coach there, we know everything that's happened with him over in that hub in Perth, and the fine that he and Brenton Sanderson received. He doesn't want to talk about how long Scott Pendlebury is going to be out from injury. He won't play tomorrow night. He's continuing his rehab. Nothing to add were the quotes from Buckley. We know that the pressure's on the Collingwood Footy Club, who 3 or 4 weeks ago were being talked about as premiership chances. Their last 2 weeks, they've had their colours lowered by the West Coast Eagles and Fremantle. There's a lot of conjecture about where Darcy Moore, who's in fantastic form, should be playing, whether that's up forward or down back, whether there's room to fit Mason Cox back into the side. And just in general, a lot of things up in the air at the Collingwood Football Club. Not a lot of stability, not a lot of certainty around what their next few weeks is going to look like, which is pretty uncharacteristic for the biggest club in the AFL. Sydney, on the other hand, we know they're rebuilding. We know they've had a lot of injuries throughout the year. They're getting games into their next generation of players. Expectations pretty low on them from the footy public. If they were to pinch a win against Collingwood tonight at the Gabba, does that mean you could stick a fork in the Magpies' premiership hopes for this year?
Oh, I mean, you'd think that clearly they'd be wanting to beat Sydney. If they don't beat Sydney, then yeah, I guess you could say that their premiership hopes are. I mean, they're clearly not dashed statistically, right? Like they're on 18 points. You know, they're thereabouts. I know the Giants, the Dogs, and I think Essendon as well are on 20 points. I mean, you know, just out of the 8, you know, mathematically can still get there. But yeah, as you say, depleted Sydney side, rebuilding. If they can't knock off Sydney, you know, tonight, then as you say, given everything else that's going on, it would be definitely a kick in the teeth for them. I mean, that whole build-up, that whole story with Buckley, like there's sometimes where you just can't believe what you're reading, and to see stories of him playing tennis with Alicia Molik, like in a hub after everything that's gone on, and particularly Eddie's comments, like that was just, oh, wow, are you fair dinkum, mate? So, yeah, look, a lot going on at that club. You know, a win would just calm them down, you'd expect, against a Sydney side like that. But, yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
I think Twitter went berserk about 24 hours before the Nathan Buckley stuff happened based on Eddie's quotes, and it's a matter of time until something happens at Collingwood and he has to backtrack. I don't think anyone could believe it was the head coach of the football club and that it happened as quickly as it did. Our final story today, golf fans rejoice because we're about to have our first major of the year, the USPGA, kicking off in not too long at all. And we turn to a story from James Corrigan in The Telegraph. He's got some great quotes from Rory McIlroy. It's been 6 years, Tommy, since Rory McIlroy's won a major. We know he's one of the top players in world golf. He's certainly one of the most spoken about players. But that drought, the longer it goes on, the more pressure it piles on his shoulders. Tiger Woods, the other one who's in a group paired up with McIlroy and Justin Thomas, the new world number one. Tiger Woods, of course, winning the US Masters last year. He's still chasing Jack Nicklaus's record for the most majors of all time. He's only played the one tournament since everything resumed post-COVID and played okay, made the cut, but didn't necessarily set the world on fire. Heading into the USPGA, can Rory McIlroy, who is out of form since COVID resumption as well, can Rory McIlroy or Tiger Woods actually contend for this major?
Oh, you'd love to see it. I'm just reading some comments from a few experts. Look, they're pitching Tiger for a top 25 finish for whatever reason. It's going to be a little bit wet, which won't suit him, supposedly. As for Rory, yeah, that 6-year title run, it's been a while without a major, hasn't it? He's ranked 3rd in the world. That'll be playing on his mind big time. But it will be fascinating to see how they all come out of COVID, you know, by way of how they respond to that, given that golf doesn't really change a whole lot, you know, individual game, hitting a ball around a field. So, yeah, like it's probably not going to have affected their performance like some of the other leagues, you know, like obviously the NRL was a few weeks, the guys are wet behind the ears, the NBA, everyone's coming back into it with that little bit of time off, but you'd expect the standard's still going to be there. Oh, look, Tiger, 2019 Masters, shivers down the spine. Like, well, obviously, if he won, it wouldn't be anywhere near that. But it'd be fantastic to see. And even for Rory, he seems like a good bloke. He seems like he just would have been potting about his business and thinking long and hard how he can break that drought. So good luck to him. I might have a sneaky 10 on him.
I reckon, right. And I thought of this without thinking of the irony at first when I was trying to compare Rory's streak with someone else at the top of their game who went on a long drought in the major tournaments. His ex-fiancée, Caroline Wozniacki, is someone who comes to mind, who was at the top, 1, 2, 3 in the world rankings of the tennis tour for so long and wasn't able to break through until right at the very end. And we know that only built the pressure on her shoulders as things went on. I'm looking forward to seeing Jason Day in action. He's been in really strong form since the COVID resumption. He's really flying the flag for Australia at the moment. It'd be great to see him take home the chockies. Tom, great to have you on the show this morning. Apologies to our viewers and listeners if you pick up. We did have some technical difficulties there for a few minutes, but managed to get this one away. Awesome to have you on the show, and look forward to welcoming you back to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff in the weeks to come.
Cheers, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. That was Tom Decent from the Sydney Morning Herald. You've been watching or listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you tomorrow.